This is the last in a series of 6 lectures on choice theory. So far, what I've done in these lectures is introduce the standard economic model of individual decision making and explore the implications of that model. I also covered behavioral criticisms of the rational choice perspective. And now we're going to turn to the last topic, which is choice and welfare. We're going to ask, within this framework, how do we make statements about the individual's well-being? Let's begin with the foundations for standard welfare economics. I want to remind you to start with about our opening premises concerning individual choice. There were 2 of them. The first is that we each have coherent, stable preferences. And the second is that our preferences guide our choices. When we choose, we seek and actually achieve the greatest benefit according to our own judgment. Those 2 premises lead to our positive model of individual behavior. And to these, we are now adding a third premise that is normative in nature, and that is that each of us is the best judge of our own well-being. Now, there are various arguments one can give in favor of this third premise, and I'll mention 2 that I think are persuasive. The first involves justifications for self-determination in the tradition of classical liberalism. That is, my opinions about my own life are paramount because it is, after all, my life. The second is the Cartesian principle that experience is inherently private and not directly observable by others, which means that each of us is the only expert on our own subjective experience, and consequently, our views about our subjective experience merit deference. The implication of these 3 premises is that we can not only describe choices, but we can infer well-being from choices. So let's assume that an individual is choosing from some menu A that includes both the option X and the option Y. And the set of things that they're willing to choose from that menu includes X, but does not include Y. In that case, we are going to make the inference that the individual doesn't merely choose X when Y is available and not Y, but the individual is better off with X than with Y. That is why they choose X. This normative theory equates well-being with the fulfillment of the individual's preferences. I have preferences over what may occur, and achieving a situation where the world matches my preferences is what delivers welfare to me. And the question that I want to ask is whether that's a good way to define well-being. I'm going to talk in a minute about various schools of thought concerning welfare and well-being, but let me begin with an example that is useful to have in mind before diving into some of the abstractions. So I call this the case of the oblivious altruist. Imagine that there's a small town in Arkansas that experiences massive flooding, and that leaves many families homeless. Now, Norman is altruistic, and he would very gladly contribute $100 to a relief fund for these individuals if he knew about the flood. The government will provide relief, and it will pay for that relief with taxes, and those taxes will include a $100 levy on Norman. However, Norman never learns about the flood or the relief effort. And by the way, Norman does not like paying taxes. So the question is, does the government relief effort make Norman better off or worse off? So I want you to think about this vignette and ask yourself the question, to which of the following propositions do you subscribe? P1 is that the government relief makes Norman worse off. P2 is that it makes him better off. And P3 is it depends. Depends on what? Well, think about it. And I'll make some suggestions of what it might depend on as we go along. All right, so with that example in mind, let's talk about the main philosophical accounts of well-being. Philosophers typically group these into three general categories. The first category is welfare hedonism, which holds that well-being consists solely in the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. And this view is commonly associated with the classical utilitarians, in particular Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Now, Bentham and Mill did not agree entirely with respect to their views of pleasure and pain. Bentham held that that all pleasure and pain was qualitatively undifferentiated, that different experiences differed only in matters of intensity. Mill, on the other hand, thought that there were important qualitative differences between different types of pleasure. Now, extending Mill's perspective, you might simply observe that different experiences cause different sensations, what we might call mental states. And then you might say a more general and appealing version of the same perspective might simply hold that all welfare is derived from those mental states. So the general notion that welfare is exclusively a reflection of our mental states is called mental statism. It is a particular brand of welfare hedonism. The second category of philosophical approaches to well-being is called desire theory or preference theory. And these approaches hold that well-being consists in having one's desires satisfied. Now, what does that mean? That means that the actual state of the world is what the individual wants it to be, and not whether the individual necessarily knows this to be true. It is simply the match between the world and the individual's desires. And this perspective is implicit in modern welfare economics. We look at people's preferences. We assume that welfare is delivered when the state of the world, when the configuration of the world matches what the individual prefers. Now, there is a subtle variant of desire theory, which I think is worth mentioning, which is that part of the description of the actual state of the world is the individual's mental states. So when you think about the way you want the world to be, you may describe things out there in the world, but you may also describe what you think and what you feel. Okay, so in that sense, desire theory, preference theory, can encompass welfare hedonism. It may be that somebody takes the view that their desires are only defined over their mental states. And then the final category of philosophical accounts of well-being involve objective lists. And these approaches hold that well-being is a matter of having certain goods in one's life, goods that are simply worth having, objectively speaking. And the classic articulation of this view is found in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, although there are more modern versions of this perspective. Okay, now let's return to the case of the oblivious altruist. And remember that there are three different propositions that you could embrace here. One is that the government relief makes Norman worse off. One is that it makes him better off. And the other is it depends. Now, let's suppose you embrace proposition one, the government relief makes Norman worse off. Well, in that case, you're likely a mental statist. So why is that the case? Well, Norman doesn't know about the relief effort. It can't affect his mental states. However, he hates paying taxes, and so his mental states are probably worse if the government provides relief. So Norman is therefore worse off. And if you're attracted to that perspective, you will likely be drawn to approaches to measuring welfare involving what's called subjective well-being, happiness, life satisfaction, and so forth. Reports of people's, in some sense, aggregate mental state. What about the second proposition? What if you think the government relief makes Norman better off? Well, then you may well be a preference theorist. The idea being that Norman's preference is that he would certainly be willing to give up $100 if it went to flood relief, and that's what the government is doing, so the configuration of the world matches his desire. Therefore, his welfare is high. And if that is appealing to you, then you'll probably be drawn to kinds of choice-oriented approaches to welfare that we deploy in economics. Now, if you adopt this second proposition, it may also be that you subscribe to an objective list theory. You may take the view that providing the funds for helping people in need is simply a good thing to do, and that anyone who does a good thing, well, that enhances their welfare. So this could also be a reflective of objective list reasoning. And then finally, if you adopt proposition 3, it depends, well, you may be a subtle preference theorist. And what I mean by that is you may say, well, I can't really tell here. It's really up to Norman. Norman's preferences, I don't know whether they depend on his mental states. It could be that Norman places a lot of weight on his mental states and wouldn't be happy living in a society where people receive this kind of help unless he knew that he was paying for it. Or you could take the opposite view that Norman may not care that he actually knows about these things. He just wants to live in what he considers a good society. So it depends on what Norman's preferences are, how much they depend on his mental states, and you just can't answer the question without more information. The foundational outlook for standard welfare economics is really what I've been calling subtle preference theory. But in practice, implementations usually invoke just the simple version of preference theory that doesn't refer to mental states. Now, one could quibble with this example as follows. You could say, look, the example is contrived and it's unrealistic because in practice, there'd be some likelihood that Norman would eventually discover the truth about the relief effort, in which case the mental statist would also place weight on the actual benefits of the relief program. And that's certainly true, but the mental statist would say that the weight placed on the benefits of the relief program have to be commensurate with the likelihood that Norman learns about it. So if he doesn't learn about it with much probability, if that probability is tiny, then you're just not going to place much weight on those benefits. The simple preference theorist, on the other hand, would say that all the weight should be placed on how Norman basically would feel if he knew. It's what his actual preferences are over the different configurations of the world. And the subtle preference theorist could potentially say something in between, that it's kind of up to Norman and it depends upon the weight that Norman's preferences attach to his mental states. Now I'm going to turn to philosophical objections to preference theory or desire theory, this class of approaches to welfare and well-being. And the criticisms that I'm going to talk about, and you can find these in philosophical discussions of welfare and how economists approach welfare, they fall into the 5 categories that I've listed here. And instead of reading through them now, I'm just going to go through them one by one. The first one is really a very interesting criticism. It's what I call the what you don't know can't hurt or help you critique. And you see versions of this appearing in the writing of various philosophers. I'm going to give 3 quotes from 3 different philosophers that lay out the problem, and then I'm going to give a general response to the problem, and then one by one go back through the examples provided by each one of the philosophers and explain how the general response addresses those examples. This is from, again, Shelley Kagan from Normative Ethics. Suppose then that I'm a fan of large prime numbers, and so I hope and desire that the total number of atoms in the universe is a prime. Imagine furthermore that the total number of atoms in the universe is in point of fact a prime. Since the desire is satisfied, the preference theory must say that I am better off for it, that my life is the better for it. I don't know that my desire is satisfied, of course, but this is absurd. The number of atoms in the universe has nothing at all to do with the quality of my life. All right. Here's another example closely related from Daniel Hausman's book, Preference, Value, Choice, and Welfare. Suppose that Jill prefers it to be the case that she be descended from Charlemagne. Suppose further that these are not idle wishes. She goes to considerable trouble to determine whether her preferences are satisfied. Suppose that although her preferences are in fact satisfied, Jill cannot trace her ancestry, so she does not know that her preferences are satisfied. Is there any reason to believe that the satisfaction of Jill's self-regarding preferences makes her life any way better? The fact that a state of affairs satisfies people's preferences does not make the state of affairs good for them. Preference satisfaction theories of well-being are mistaken. The final example is from the philosopher Derek Parfit in his book Reasons and Persons. He writes, suppose that I meet a stranger who has what is believed to be a fatal disease. My sympathy is aroused, and I strongly want this stranger to be cured. We never meet again. Later, unknown to me, this stranger is cured. On the unrestricted desire fulfillment theory, this event is good for me and makes my life go better. This is not plausible. We should reject this theory. All right, so three philosophers all saying something similar, all saying that this theory makes no sense. And if standard economic welfare analysis is based on this desire theoretic, preference theoretic approach, what do we make of these objections? Well, here's my response. In economics, we're only concerned with welfare in settings where there is an actionable issue. What do I mean by that? We're not interested in saying absolutely right now, what is your level of well-being? That's not a question that's of interest to economists. Welfare only becomes an interesting question for us when there's something to be done. Now, a property that unifies all of these examples is that there are no actionable issues in any of them. If a conceptual problem with an approach only arises outside the domain of its application, then you really don't need to worry about it. So let's return to each one of these examples and introduce actionable issues, and then ask whether there remains a problem or not. Okay, so first of all, let me modify Parfit's stranger example. And here's a version that makes it easy for us. You know of an experimental treatment program, and you can either refer the stranger to it or do nothing. It's still the case that you never learn the outcome. The rest of the example is the same. You are better off if you refer the stranger because you prefer the stranger to have a chance of survival, even if you know you'll never learn the outcome. Okay, so there's a feature of this extension of Parfit's example that's extremely important, and this will come up repeatedly. Once you introduce an actionable issue, you then have to think about preferences in the context of the actionable issue. You have to think about the preferences that are pertinent to the actionable issue. Here, the preferences pertinent to the actionable issue are over lotteries. These lotteries govern the health outcome for the stranger rather than over the ultimate outcomes, which you don't know about. So if you don't refer the stranger, he has a very bad lottery, almost certain death. If you do refer the stranger, he's going to have a much better lottery, and you prefer him to have the second lottery to the first lottery. Therefore, you refer him. If he gets that reference, you are better off. There is no puzzle here. Now, here's a harder version to deal with. Same example, all the details are the same, except the government funds an experimental treatment program that gives the stranger a greater chance of survival, paying for it by taxing people like you. And you would be willing to contribute handsomely to that program, but you have no idea it exists or that your taxes pay for it. So does its existence make you better off? Well, if you are listening closely, you'll realize that the hard version of this example is equivalent to the case of the oblivious altruist. It essentially raises the same issues. And some philosophers will assert that the answer for the hard version is obvious, that without knowledge of the policy, you can't be better off, and without knowledge of the tax, with knowledge of the taxes, you must be worse off. That certainly appears to be the implication of the arguments that appear in Hausman's and Parfit's discussions of these examples. And yet it's not obvious how they reach this conclusion without simply assuming the conclusion that only mental states can matter. And that's exactly what's at issue here. So the preference theoretic response is that we have to consider the preferences pertinent to the actionable issue. And they will tell us whether and how your awareness is relevant to your well-being. So to illustrate, let's extend the example a little bit further. You're generally aware that legitimate needs like the stranger's arise from time to time. You would prefer to live in a world where the government addresses these needs as they come up as a matter of policy, regardless of whether you're aware of the specific needs, the responses, or the existence of the policy. Okay, so here you can see that the actionable issue that I'm talking about is whether society should have policies like this. And now the preferences that are relevant are the preferences over the existence of such policies in general. You are expressing a preference for living in a society that addresses these sorts of problems in this way. We can elicit that kind of preference. All right. Subtle preference theory would then say your welfare is greater with the policy in place, even if you didn't specifically know about this policy, provided you've expressed these types of preferences. In this instance, confining attention to mental states, your mental states, would appear to lead to the wrong conclusion because this policy, its existence, is not going to improve your mental states, and yet it clearly makes you better off. Let's try applying these same ideas to the other two examples. First of all, let's look at the Charlemagne problem. Here, the actionable issue that we introduce is going to be whether to pay for genealogical research, given that the results of the research are uncertain and the effort may prove inconclusive. Do you want to pay for that research or not? That's the actionable question. For that issue, what are the pertinent preferences? Well, the pertinent preferences would be defined over the costs of the research and the lottery that you would receive of findings. Jill has preferences over those, and if she makes a decision that the costs of the research are worth it to her to have the lottery of potential findings, knowing full well that it could prove inconclusive, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say she is better off when she gives up the money to have the research conducted. How about the prime preference problem? Well, this is such a far-fetched example that I have to give a very highly hypothetical actionable issue. So here the issue will be whether to pay for a machine that counts all the atoms in the universe and then split some as needed to assure that the total is prime. For this actionable issue, the pertinent preferences are defined again over costs, in this case, the costs of creating this hypothetical machine, and the primeness of the total. And if the individual in this example were to say, yeah, it's worth it to me to build this machine to ensure that there's a prime number of atoms in the universe, then we would conclude that he is better off when he pays for building the machine. Now, to my eye, the implications of preference theory are quite compelling in the variants of Parfit's stranger example that I've described. They may feel a little bit less compelling in these two other applications, to the prime preference problem and to the Charlemagne problem. So why is that the case? Why do they feel less compelling? Is that because there's something wrong with the preference theoretic perspective? And my view is no, that's not the case. That what animates the original examples are aversion to the conclusion that the individuals would be better off is not so much the subject's lack of awareness of whether preferences are satisfied, but rather that the subject's desire implicitly involves a belief that in reading the examples, we immediately suspect to be false. Okay, we tend to assume that the reason for the preference is a belief that life will be better if, in Jill's case, she discovers that she is a descendant of Charlemagne. And in the case of Kagan's subject, if he is reassured that the number of atoms in the universe is prime. And at the same time, we are implicitly confident that these subjects will discover, on the contrary, that their lives are unchanged, and that having made the investments in the genealogical research, perhaps turns up the proof that Jill is a descendant of Charlemagne, that Jill will be disappointed, and that likely Kagan's subject will be disappointed once he ensures that the number of atoms in the universe is prime. They will discover that their lives are no different. So if there is a problem here, once an actionable issue is introduced, it probably involves false beliefs. Here we have the suspicion that somehow these statements about welfare in these last two examples are wrong, but they're wrong because of false beliefs. Okay, and false beliefs is a different problem. It's another one on the list. We're not going to get to it yet. First, we're going to talk about a couple of others. One of them is ethically problematic preferences. This is another concern that many philosophers have expressed. A couple of things come up in these discussions. One category involves preferences that are either sadistic or masochistic. Now, what do we think about sadistic or masochistic preferences? Are we willing to respect those? In the first place, in some cases, these desires may hinge on false beliefs. The belief that either I'll feel better, but I won't, or that I don't think I'm causing myself or others long-run emotional or physical harm, but I am. So one way out is to say, look, I think this is just another case of false beliefs. But there may be instances in which sadism and masochism aren't driven by false beliefs. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that these desires are robust and that they hinge on beliefs that are either accurate or at least not falsifiable. So an example of the latter would be a religious belief that the practice of mortification of the flesh improves prospects for the afterlife. There's no way to prove that that's wrong. So you can't say that the belief that mortification of the flesh helps me in the afterlife is a false belief. Well, in that case, preference theory would require us to accept the implications for individual welfare, that those practices make those individuals better off. And the question you need to ask yourself is, well, is that wrong? If that's what the individual wants and the individual gets it and they understand what they're doing and they understand the implications of the consequences, is it the case that they aren't better off? Within the context of Stanford welfare analysis, we could accept the implication that they are better off, at least from their own perspective, and then handle effects on others through consideration of externalities. Society might decide that the externalities outweigh the benefits that the individual receives in terms of their own mental states or experiences. In the process of social aggregation, we're also free to attach disproportionate weight to sadistic externalities if we feel that that judgment is ethically warranted. So within the context of desire theory or preference theory, we would handle these concerns in that fashion. Another example that sometimes comes up about problematic preferences is expensive tastes. And here it seems to me that the arguments are sometimes very confused. The following is from Daniel Hausman's book. Suppose that Jack has cultivated a taste for fine wine and consequently is worse off than Jill, who has a similar income but is happy with beer. Should Jack get more resources because he needs more to satisfy his preference? Well, again, the concern here appears to pertain to aggregation rather than to the assessment of individual well-being. There's no problem with saying that Jack is better off if he has fine wine and less well off if he doesn't, because he would choose, he desires fine wine. Moreover, depending on the social aggregator, it's not at all obvious that Hausman is right, that Jack would get more than Jill if we treated preferences as an indication of well-being. Expenditure on Jack may actually go up or down, depending upon whether what an economist would think of as the price elasticity of social spending on his utility is greater or less than unity. We as a society could decide that Jack is just too expensive to please, and consequently it's not in society's interest to trade off, to make the trade-offs that would be necessary to improve his welfare. Now, part of this example is that Jack appears to choose his preferences. Hausman says that Jack cultivates the taste for fine wine. And I think that that's to try and emphasize that this really isn't necessary, that this is something that Jack has inflicted on himself. Well, in that case, this example really pertains to the fifth objection, to changing preferences. Jack has changed his preferences here intentionally. And I think that that's an interesting and important issue, but it's not quite the same thing as a situation where I just have preferences that are more difficult to satisfy. The third category of philosophical objections to preference theory involves inconsistencies and instabilities. This is the core of not just a philosophical argument, but also the behavioral critique of the standard model of choice. So I've already discussed a lot of these inconsistencies and instabilities. I think this is a real criticism. It's a serious criticism, and it's one of the reasons why we need a generalization of standard welfare economics that applies in behavioral economics. And that's something that I've worked on and talk about in the behavioral economics sequence. The fourth category of philosophical objections to preference theories, which I've already alluded to, involves false beliefs. To give an example of false beliefs, consider this version of the stranger example. As before, we'll assume the government funds an experimental treatment program that gives the stranger a greater chance of survival and pays for it by taxing people like you. You'd be willing to contribute handsomely to the program if you thought it was effective, but you believe falsely that it's not. You'll never learn treatment outcomes. So does that policy make you better off? You know about the policy and you believe that it's ineffective. So does the fact that you are paying for a program that you falsely believe is ineffective, are you then worse off? Likewise, we can ask, what if the treatment program is ineffective, but you falsely believe it to be effective? Are you then better off because you feel happy about contributing taxes to a government program that you think is effective but isn't? Now, some philosophers think that these type of examples undermine preference theory, at least in its unrestricted form, because these desires, these preferences, are ill-conceived. The preference for either having this government policy or not having this government policy. Economists would say that perspective is actually confused because we distinguish between preferences and beliefs. And in this example, preferences aren't defined over the policies. You can't talk about preference for the policy. Preferences are defined over treatment costs and probabilities of success. The policy is simply an instrument for achieving those ends. Now, there's nothing wrong here in this example with the individual's underlying preferences. Absolutely nothing at all. Rather, the problem arises because the subject has an incorrect belief about the effectiveness of the instrument. They believe that the choice, which in this case is the government policy, that it produces some lottery other than the lottery it actually produces. False beliefs are actually subsumed under the heading of inconsistencies, the last set of objections. And I've already made this point earlier on, that you can think about false beliefs as a case of context dependence, that presentation of a lottery in different ways will elicit different expressions of desire. And that indicates that with some of these presentations, the beliefs about what the lottery represents must be wrong. The fifth and final category of philosophical objections to preference theoretic approaches to well-being, at least that I'm going to talk about, is that preferences can change. And this is considered particularly problematic when the change is the result of oppression. Amartya Sen gives the example of a happy slave who has decided to accept his lot in life and who has convinced himself that being a slave is actually a good thing. And so he desires to remain a slave. And I think that we can infer that this is probably the result of being oppressed and talking himself into believing that what he can't avoid is actually not that bad. Now, that said, while certain types of changing preferences are certainly concerning, the example that I gave, I agree is quite concerning, others are not. And let me give one example. Jack is finishing college and wants to go to medical school. Due to financial pressures, he has to take a job working as a plumber's assistant. And over time, he learns the trade and starts his own business. And in 15 years, he owns a thriving plumbing service and supply company. He's happy. He no longer wants to be a doctor. Now, according to some philosophers, such as Daniel Hausman, this type of example is problematic for preference theory, that the satisfaction of Jack's original preferences would make him worse off because he shouldn't change and become a doctor. But this criticism is based on a confusion about the object of preference. It treats the options very simplistically as either be a doctor or be a plumber. In fact, his original choice was go to medical school after college and become a doctor, or become a plumber after college and build a business. His choice 15 years later is leave a successful plumbing business to go to medical school and become a doctor versus continue running a successful plumbing business. If Jack preferred becoming a doctor in the first instance, but not the second, well, that doesn't mean his preferences have changed. Rather, it means the choice options have changed. Making him a doctor after he successfully builds a plumbing business, rather than before he does it, does not satisfy his original preference. So I think in analyzing examples like this, Hausman and others are actually incorrect. Now, to make this case more interesting, what if we change the example as follows? Jack's original desire to become a doctor extends to the conditions that actually emerged. So after finishing college, he thought to himself, I'm planning to build a plumbing business over the next 15 years so I can afford to go to medical school and be a doctor. In that case, his original preferences have indeed changed, and his desires exhibit time inconsistency. But then this is just another example of criticism number 3 about inconsistencies and instabilities. Time inconsistency is just a form of context-dependent preferences. So my conclusion from all of this is that the primary objection to preference theory boils down to issues involving inconsistencies and instabilities in preferences. And those are the core topics of behavioral economics, and in particular, behavioral welfare economics, as soon as we start to talk about normative issues. So with that in mind, I want to close by describing the main behavioral critiques of standard welfare economics rather than the philosophical critiques. And these behavioral critiques apply to each one of the 3 premises that provide the foundation for standard welfare economics. So let's go through those premises and describe the critiques. The first premise is that we each have coherent, stable preferences. And here we have what I call the coherence critique. That choices are sensitive to apparently irrelevant contextual features of decision problems, and that consequently judgments are likely constructed, not accessed, and the notions of true preferences and aggregate experienced utility are just fictions. Okay, the coherence critique says we don't actually have coherent, stable preferences. We do make judgments, and those judgments have a degree of consistency between them. So we don't do random things, but we have to recognize that judgments are not completely coherent. The second premise of standard welfare economics is that our preferences guide our choices, that when we choose, we seek and achieve the greatest benefit to ourselves. This premise is subject to what I call the implementation critique, that our decision-making apparatus is imperfect. So people do not reliably advance their own objectives. And that could be for reasons like holding false beliefs. There are other potential problems with implementation, but that's certainly one of them. The third premise of standard welfare economics is that each of us is the best judge of our own well-being. And here we could offer what I would call a judgment critique, that people are willing to make trade-offs that are not in their interests, even when they know what they're doing. Personally, I'm not very persuaded by judgment critiques. To me, they simply reflect differences of opinion between the person making the choices and the analyst. So the important criticisms from behavioral economics, from my perspective, mainly concern the coherence critique and implementation critiques.